All right, good morning, everyone. On behalf of the Kentucky Department of Education, we would like to welcome you to today's webinar, which was designed for additional targeted support and improvement, or ATSI schools who are identified as such in 2019-20 and will also be first-time grant recipients of school improvement funds. My colleague and I, Ruth Swanson, we would like to thank you for committing some of your time today as we recognize just how busy and overwhelmed you may be. So we respect and value your time, and we plan to be very efficient in communicating with you today. By way of introductions, my name is Natasha Stein, and I'm the Program Manager of District 180 in the Office of Continuous Improvement and Support. And again, I'm joined today by a colleague, and I will allow her an opportunity to introduce herself as well.
Good morning. My name is Ruth Swanson, and I'm a program consultant with District 180. I provide support and guidance for ATSI and TSI schools, and I also review and approve school improvement fund applications. We did want to give you an opportunity just to put a face with our names this morning, but we will be turning our cameras off so that we can save bandwidth during the presentation.
So the webinar that you're participating in today, when we created it with several school and district level personnel in mind, and those include the following: additional targeted support and improvement principals and teams, Title I coordinators, finance officers, and school improvement specialists. And our primary goal is to equip you with the necessary information that you need to successfully complete the School Improvement Funds grant application. And we do ask that you stay with us for the entirety of today's webinar. Again, we do plan to be very efficient because we value your time, so it'll take us probably around 50 or so minutes with content, and then any extra time we can use for questions or early dismissal or both, whatever the case may be there for us. But again, please stay with us till the very end because you will receive a link to a training verification form, and that's where you're going to verify your attendance and participation in today's webinar. So again, please stay with us until the end to ensure that you do receive that unique link to this webinar.
So before we review today's agenda items, we would like to remind you of several norms. First of all, we ask that you actively participate. This can be either through note-taking, listening intently, asking follow-up questions, etc. While we are primarily communicating one way, we will give you the opportunity to ask any clarifying questions that you may have at the end of each large agenda item. We will use the chat box to host those questions, so if you could please remember to have your mics muted during the presentation, and instead of asking your questions aloud, please type those in the chat box and we will address those at the end of each agenda item. You should have received the PowerPoint ahead of time in an email from Natasha, as well as an electronic template. And I have dropped that PowerPoint into the chat box in case you need it. And I'm just getting ready here to drop the template as well into there. You can always let us know, by email if you need extra copies of these, and we will be happy to get those to you. We do encourage you to follow along and take notes on your slides, as we will be discussing the application in more detail throughout the presentation. Likewise, we do ask that you remain patient. I'm sure we all know by now that technology can be inconsistent and sometimes faulty, but we will do our best to assist you and try to make sure that the technology runs as smoothly as we can. And then lastly, we ask that you please share any information that you learned today with any teammates who may not have been able to join us and who might need that information. So during today's presentation, we will review the following content. We've already taken care of welcome and introductions. We will look at the grant's purpose and the different supporting roles in the whole process. We'll take a look at the components of that SIF application and talk about the multi-layer process that's involved. It's a collaboration between the school and the district and their respective responsibilities. We will talk about allowability of the activities that you choose. And within there, we'll look at evidence-based requirements. We'll take a look at the RAND guidance, which you may be familiar with if you've been involved with Title I. And then we'll take a look at the funding matrix that is in place for this particular grant. We'll also talk about some supporting documentation that's needed with the application, and we'll walk through the whole submission process. We'll talk about the awarding of funds. We'll give you timelines and talk about the deadlines involved. And then, as I said, you can put questions in the chat box as we go along, but also once we reach the end, if there are questions that you didn't get answered, we're happy to stick around and answer those questions, or we'll leave you with our contact information so that if those questions come up later, that you can get a hold of us. So let's take a look at the purpose of these funds and the different roles that are involved in this application process. As part of its responsibility authorized under Section 1003 of the Every Student Succeeds Act, the Kentucky Department of Education, or KDE, is required to award funds to local educational agencies, LEAs, to implement support and improvement activities in those schools identified for additional targeted support and improvement, or ATSI. So these funds may be used for activities that the school determines and KDE agrees will improve outcomes for your students, specifically those in your targeted subgroup. So when determining the activities that you're going to be supporting with these funds, you want to kind of think about the following three themes. You want to think about evidence, alignment, and collaboration. So let's take a look at each of those a little bit deeper. When you're considering evidence, all funded activities must be supported by evidence-based practices with levels 1, 2, or 3 evidence only. So I know that some of you may have had evidence-based practices that were approved in your CSIPs last year that had level 4 evidence. But it's important to note that for these funds, the evidence-based practices that have evidence that only demonstrates a rationale at level 4 cannot be supported with SIF funds. So you may need to take a look at your evidence-based practices that you've been implementing, and we want to ensure that they do have that documentation of evidence level 1, 2, or 3 in order to be funded with these funds. In terms of alignment, all activities must be supported or must be included in this application as well as in your ATSI school CSIP. So as with all school improvement initiatives, these activities must be consistent with your school's needs assessment, specifically the needs of your targeted subgroup as well. If you were involved in your CSIP last year, you know that we worked with you to make sure that we could see that evidence-based practice in your CSIP goals and activities somewhere. So you want to ensure that that happens again this year. And then as a collaborative effort, you're going to determine these activities with input from stakeholders. That might include school staff, your school-based decision-making council, district leaders, and others. So make sure that this is a collaborative effort. Now, within the grant process, each entity plays an important role. So once you've gone through that collaborative process and you've determined your activities, each ATSI school is going to use an electronic template to record the specifics of the proposed activities. So the local educational agency or district is going to collaborate with the school to determine a specific process to have the core components of the application entered into the GMAP system. So districts will also complete several narratives themselves where they'll describe their plan to monitor and support implementation and to assist with the sustainability of the proposed activities after grant funding has been depleted. And then as the state educational agency, KDE will review and approve the applications and award the funds. Now, additional information and detail about each of these steps, including the template, is going to be shared throughout the webinar.
So before we move into this next agenda item, are there any questions that anyone has thus far? You, again, may utilize that chat box to ask those, or if you feel more comfortable and would prefer to email Ruth or myself, we're happy to accept questions that way as well. But Please keep in mind that we are planning to stop after each agenda item just to allow you some opportunity to think about the information, then also ask any questions as they may come about. So we will move forward then with the process for completing the school improvement funds application. And again, as Ruth shared, this is a multi-layer process. So each ATSI school and the district itself is responsible for completing some portion of the application. And as we review this agenda item, you're going to learn more about those core components of the application and KDE's guidance on how you can satisfy each of those core components. So we're going to start here with some information regarding the official application. So the official application is located in GMAP, and GMAP stands for Grant Management Application and Planning System. And once it goes live to districts, it will be found under fiscal year 2021. If you're looking at that screenshot there that's being projected, or if you're looking at the materials that we sent to you, the funding application is named School Improvement Funds ATSI. So it's very important that you select the right version of the application. There are several in GMAP, so make certain that if you're responsible for the GMAP portion of this application, that you are using that one. Generally speaking, though, we wanted to make this very clear. Access to GMAP is limited to district personnel, and that's because it hosts a significant amount of budgetary and financial information for every school in the district, including the district itself. So when I sent out the calendar invite and that follow-up email, it contained a copy of this presentation and a template as well, an electronic template. So you may be wondering, why do we have a template if GMAP is where the official application is housed? And that's where this multi-layer process comes into play. So in the next slides, I'm really going to hone in and talk about in great detail how we intend for the ATSI school and the district to navigate those processes of this multi-layered system. So again, as I shared, GMAP is generally limited. So generally is the key term there. There may be some outliers where principals do have access, but generally ATSI principals won't. So instead, we created a template that resembles what's in GMAP. And principals, SBDM councils, ER staff, all of those collaborative parties, they can use that template when determining which evidence-based initiatives will be funded through the school improvement funds. Once that electronic template is completed to the ATSI school satisfaction, it can be emailed to the appropriate district personnel, point person, or it can be uploaded into a shared site that the district uses. Thereafter, information will be transferred into the official GMAP application on the school's behalf. And that's obviously going to require some additional internal conversation and some orchestration there as well through the central office, as well as, what that process should look like between the school and central office. So we encourage you to converse with your internal teams and let principals know how to get that information to you at central office level. And again, I want to reiterate that the official application that KDE will review and approve is in GMAP. A couple of districts on the call already with us today, you already have processes established because you've done this with your CSI schools, so it's completely fine to continue that same method. Just ensure that your ATSI principals are aware of those protocols as well. So I'm going to pause for a second or two here just to see if you have any questions and let that information soak in before we move forward.
Okay, seeing no questions, we'll go ahead and start the walkthrough of the electronic template. Oh, I see one question popped up. Will the application appear on our GMAP home screen? And yes, it will. When it becomes available, it will show up there on your GMAP home screen. Good question.
And let me also chime in on that. That's a great question. So thank you for that, Sherry. So yes, it will be on your home screen, and I will alert everyone who received our original emails that it is live and you can begin inputting information in there. It's expected to be live and open to you within the next couple of weeks, but don't fret or get overly concerned about that because we will talk about a timeline with you shortly. But just know that it will be open to you soon. And I do see another question. Is there a user right that needs to be added to the district person in charge of this? And the answer to that is yes. And that answer applies to any new school who has not participated in the school improvement, or excuse me, any new district that has not participated in the school improvement funds process. Within GMAP, there is a role that is entitled School Improvement Director. I believe that's what it's called. This will be forthcoming in an email as well. But yes, you will need to establish that role in there like you do with the other applications in GMAP so that that person can sign off on this application. That's a great question as well. So yes, and I will be sending an email with project numbers as well as the correct name for that. I can't remember it exactly off the top of my head, but it's something with School Improvement Director, I believe. Okay, Ruth.
Okay, great questions. Okay, so to ensure consistency with the application, we're going to just go through and point out a few key features. And if you have that template nearby, you might want to take notes on it. Again, you can always get a clean copy if you need one further down the line. So at the top of the electronic template, you're going to notice two sections asking for total school enrollment and total award amount. When you're looking at that total school enrollment, we're going to ask that you pull the enrollment number from Infinite Campus from October 1st of 2019. So this number you're going to input into the GMAP application, and it's really not so tied to the award amount itself, but instead we like to use it as a reference when we're reviewing and approving applications, just so we can kind of ensure that your expenditures are reasonable and that they align to the enrollment number of the school. So for example, if your school had 152 students in school on October 1st of 2019, we wouldn't expect you to ask for maybe 180 software licenses or 500 Chromebooks. That wouldn't be reasonable, wouldn't match up. If it happens that your school was not in session on October 1st, maybe you had professional learning that happened on October 1st and 2nd, or you were on a fall break, that's fine. You're going to use the next date when school was in session with students present to pull that enrollment number from. And again, this is just kind of a reference point for us to kind of gauge the reasonableness of expenditures as we're going through. We also ask that you list your total award amount, and we know you don't have that yet, and it is coming to you in a short while. But the purpose is to ensure that when you are budgeting your funds, that all those funds are accounted for. So it's more of a reminder for you. To those of you who are handling the GMAP side of the application, this will already be pre-populated in there for you. So, but please remember that all funds must be budgeted to zero when you get into that GMAP system. We don't want you to have to give, any of these monies back. We want them to be used for the benefit of your students in their entirety. So as we look at the template, you're going to notice that there are several core components in the application. The first one is outline of the school's evidence-based initiatives in chart form. The next is the completion of a detailed budget for years 1 and 2. And then there's a description of how the initiatives will be monitored. So let's take a look at each of those three components a little closer. The first component is the outlining of the evidence-based initiatives in chart form. So you can see the chart here that's on the template, and it resembles what you're going to see in GMAP. In the first column, the principal is going to list a subgroup improvement priority that was determined through a needs assessment or a root cause analysis process. Now, I know many of you went through a 2-day review last year, so there may have been some improvement priorities that specifically targeted your subgroups that could be very beneficial here. So in column 1, you are listing a subgroup improvement priority, and this improvement priority is going to be addressed by an evidence-based practice that you're going to list in column 2. The evidence-based practice must be addressed in the school improvement plan to be funded by the school improvement funds. And so this means it should appear in the activities that you choose for at least one of your CSIP goals. And then also remember, there is that special consideration section of the CSIP template where it asks the ATSI schools to list and explain their evidence-based practices. So you should be seeing this alignment. Everything aligns the CSIP with this particular application. Also remember that the evidence-based practice must meet level 1, 2, or 3 evidence requirements to be funded with this money. And monies must be spent on practices that really provide a return on investment. The other thing I want to mention is when you look at column 2 here, you see that the only thing that's written is the name of that evidence-based practice. This is not a place to provide the citation for it, to provide an explanation for it. We just want the name of that evidence-based practice. We do pull this information for different reports, and so we don't want a lot of extraneous information in there. We just want the name of that evidence-based practice. So then when you move over to column 3, here you're going to list and number every resource that you believe is necessary for the successful implementation of that evidence-based practice. So this might include things like training fees or program fees or instructional resources. So you're going to list and number each resource that you think is necessary. And then in column 4, you're going to provide a brief explanation as to how or why each of the requested resources is needed for successful implementation. Each explanation should be numbered to match your resources. So if you have 4 resources, you should have 4 explanations, and those numbers should match up. Your explanation might include things like what is currently available and why that's not sufficient for your subgroup, or maybe what the current level of staff knowledge or skill is in a particular area and why you are wanting to increase the capacity with that. So you can see on the screen an example, and one thing to keep in mind too is that this template and the GMAP application includes several rows. So you may have more than one improvement priority, you may have more than one improvement or evidence-based practice, but you should only have one evidence-based practice per row. So each practice gets its own row. It is okay to duplicate the improvement priorities if there is more than one practice that you're going to align to it, but each practice should have its own row. This is one of the trickier parts of the application, so I'll stop here to see if there's any questions about this first component. Okay, not seeing any. We'll move ahead, but you know that we're always available to answer questions once you have a chance to kind of digest this and really look through it a little bit more. So the second core component is the budget itself. So we need to know how much will the activities actually cost. So column 1, it lists the munis codes that are allowable under SIF, and Natasha will discuss more about the allowable expenditures a little bit later on. In the middle column is where you're going to provide a detailed description of the activities. So you want to include things like how many, how often, at what rate of pay. And then in that last column is where the dollar value is listed. And so if you look at the example here, this particular school wants to participate in some kind of professional learning, and there's a registration fee attached to that. So in their description, they're going to include the name of the conference or the training. They're going to include that they want to send 6 teachers from grades 3 and 4. And so they're taking the $625 registration fee times the 6 teachers that they're sending. And then obviously in the next column, they're going to put that total amount in there. So a couple of things to think about here. The greater the detail in that description section, the better. And this will increase the likelihood of an efficient approval process. Because if we don't have all that information that we need, it's going to be a lot of back and forth where we're going to have to request, okay, how many teachers are you sending? What's the actual registration fee? All those kinds of good things. So the more information you can put here, the better. And you will notice that in the template and in GMAP that you can spread the funds across 2 years, but you do not have to. Once you find what your allocation is, and if you determine that your allotment is only enough to cover 1 year, it is okay to budget all the funds in year 1. That's up to you how you want to spread the funds. So Natasha will elaborate on this a little bit later, but we do want to remind you that you want to spend your funds on activities that can be sustained. We don't want these, one and done type things. So invest your funds where you know you're going to get the biggest return. We really want to equip the teachers with some sound evidence-based practices that can translate into improved student outcomes. So I see a question in the chat box that is asking about evidence-based practices. And it says, should evidence-based practices come from sources such as the What Works Clearinghouse? Are there sources for evidence-based practices that KDE recommends? Great question. And the first place I would point you to is the evidence-based practices webpage on the KDE website. Tons of information there. And on the right-hand side, there is a list of places that you can go to start your, search for evidence-based practices. And yes, What Works Clearinghouse is one of those places. So I encourage you to check out that website. I also encourage you to work with your ER staff. They're very well versed in kind of the process for looking for evidence and evidence-based practices.
And that resource that Ruth is referencing, I believe it's entitled Clearinghouses and Databases, and it's even organized by topics and themes. So a wealth of knowledge and other resources outside of What Works Clearinghouse if you can't find what you're looking for on that database or within that clearinghouse rather.
Yep, great question. Okay, so the third component and the last component is where you're going to be asked to elaborate on the systems you have in place to monitor the success of the initiatives. So again, this monitoring system should also be aligned with what you have in your CSIP activities. You know that on your CSIP template, there's a place that talks about progress monitoring. So it should definitely be in there. And any place else that your CSIP is going to ask you about monitoring the activities that you're including here in this application should be a part of that as well. So those core components on the template are the same in GMAP. And so before we kind of transition to the district responsibilities, are there any other questions about the school's responsibilities? With either the evidence-based practices, the budget, or the monitoring piece? Again, I'll just remind you to lean on your leadership team, your stakeholder input, and definitely your ER staff for assistance. And of course, you want to abide by any parameters that the district might communicate to you regarding how they intend for you to manage this application. Okay, so we'll move on to the district responsibilities. Obviously, the district's help is needed to ensure that information is transferred from that template into the GMAP application. But in addition to that, the district also has several questions that it must answer as well. So the screenshot on this slide here kind of elaborates on what the district is responsible for answering in GMAP. I realize how small the print is on here. And so if you would like a printout of these, to kind of be looking at and thinking about before the application is actually open, we would be happy to send something like that to you. So just email and let us know.
And to clarify before Ruth moves forward here, the questions that you're seeing on the screen, they're not in that template that was shared with the school. Those are only the school level responsibilities. So these district responsibilities, again, will only be listed in GMAP, and that's because you have direct access to those once the application goes live, excuse me. But just like Ruth said, if you want to get a head start and look more closely at these questions, we're happy to make a PDF of those and get them to you so that you can review them early. Just email either one of us and we'll get that to you. We would be happy to do that. I do see a question here about when do we anticipate the application going live. So again, within the next couple of weeks, as early as next week as well. So we're still working with our vendor to fine tune just a few things remaining within the application, but they're minor. So within the next week, we're hoping, but 2 weeks at the latest, it should be available to everyone. And we're going to talk more about the overall timeline towards the end of the presentation, but that's generally speaking what to expect with regards to the GMAP application going live. So Ruth, I'll turn it back over to you.
I see the question in there. Can we email that PDF to everyone? Yep, we can sure do that.
Can. Yeah, so that's another key part. Anyone who registers at the end using that training verification, I'll use that list to know whom to get that PDF to. So make sure you stay with us to the end and register using that link that you were here and participated, and we'll send it out using those email addresses. Good question, Tim. Thank you for that.
Okay, so as far as these district level narratives, there's kind of three primary sets of questions, and they're categorized by the following themes: the improvement planning process, support and monitoring of the improvement plan, and then resource review and sustainability. So these questions ask the district to elaborate on its role with each ATSI school's improvement plan, how they intend to also monitor and support the school, and how the district intends to assist the ATSI school in sustaining its evidence-based initiatives once these funds have been depleted. So we know, and if you've been involved in any of our trainings, CSI schools, most of the responsibility for kind of monitoring and supporting is really at the state level. And that's why, they have specific ER staff that are actually in their buildings and those types of things. But when it comes to the ATSI schools, it is really on the district to provide that monitoring and support. And so these questions really get at your thinking and your planning and your systems for how that support and that monitoring will go. Responses to these should align to responses in your CDIP. There is a section in there that asks you specifically about the support and the monitoring that you're going to provide for ATSIs. And there's also a question on the executive summary for districts that asks you to kind of elaborate on this monitoring and support. So again, we want all of this to align. You're not doing multiple things. You're making your plan, and the activities and the processes behind them are going to show up both in your CSIP, in your CDIP, and in this application. So Natasha's going to review allowability next, and then she'll also include some additional information regarding district responsibilities.
So before we move forward, any questions that anyone has regarding any of the previous content? All right, so let's move forward. So in this section, we're going to talk about the allowability of expenditures under the School Improvement Fund program. So these funds, Section 10003 funds, may be used for any activity that the school determines and the department agrees will help the school identified for ATSI to improve student outcomes. And some example uses of these funds may be to implement interventions aimed at improving the school, such as professional development, tutoring opportunities to increase student achievement in the school, or a combination of those activities. And what's key with any of the activities, allowable activities, is that they must be consistent with the school's needs assessment and that CSIP as well. So Ruth has shared that information with us previously, but we'll continue to drive that home because that does impact allowability. So she's also shared information about evidence-based requirements as well. And again, these funds can only be used to support those evidence-based initiatives that meet the strong, moderate, or promising evidence. So those levels 1 through 3 evidence-based practices. And if you need additional help or information regarding that, we do have a website that's rich with resources. So we ask you to consult that. You can find information on definitions. There's tons of resources on there. There's even a technical assistance button that's at the very bottom of the page. So if there's something that you can't find evidence-based research on, please use that technical assistance button. Those requests go directly to Dr. Matthew Courtney, but he asks that you use that button because we archive all the research types of questions that we get or assistance with these evidence-based practices to kind of shape and form our systems and the work that we do. So if you email him, he's going to send you to that button. He even does it to me. So start with the button, put your questions and inquiries there, and Matthew will respond to you within 24 hours and provide you assistance and some direction on those evidence-based initiatives if you have any questions about those. And again, Ruth and I are available to assist you with those as well, should you need that assistance. So for allowable expenditures, all expenditures under the School Improvement Fund program must explicitly support the evidence-based practice that was identified in the approved CSIP that target your identified subgroup. So these items could include professional development, human capital, instructional programs, technology, parent and family engagement activities, or any of those necessary materials and supplies that would be needed to make any of those things come to life and actually be implemented. So we're going to discuss a timeline in just a few slides, but to preemptively ease any of your fears, we have built into this application submission added time for your school to follow its normal protocols and processes on amending its CSIP. If you're thinking right now, well, we didn't put any levels 1 through 3 in ours, you have enough time to first focus on your improvement plan to reconsider some of those things because you didn't know that you were getting these added funds to support some of those initiatives. So again, we've built into the process added time for you to first take care of your plan, and then that will simultaneously help you take care of some of the requirements of the School Improvement Fund so that you're not duplicating your efforts, but also meeting the obligations that you have to both of those. So when you're thinking about some of the expenditures that you want to use your school improvement funds on, we ask you to use the RAND test. This is a popular test with, or a common test with Title I expenditures, and RAND stands for reasonable, allocable, necessary, and documented. So it's just a test that you can use to ensure that the federal funds are spent responsibly. So before you put something in your grant application, ask yourself whether or not it is reasonable, it's allowable or allocable under the program, if it's necessary for the successful implementation of that evidence-based practice, and also whether or not it's documented. So this is a common example that we use to drive this point home, but there's lots of new people on here, so I'll say it again, and hopefully this gives you some added direction. So if you're a school who wants to purchase technology to support the implementation of an evidence-based practice that's listed in your CSIP, and the school has 60 students who will be impacted by that practice, can the school buy 100 iPads? And so here's the thought process there. So iPads would be, or if it was a documented need in your CSIP, it is allowable or allocable under the School Improvement Funds program. However, After that school determines that it's necessary for the successful implementation of that evidence-based practice, they would then have to determine whether or not that was reasonable. So would it be reasonable to buy 100 iPads for 60 students? So in that instance, it wouldn't be or wouldn't meet the reasonable test, so the school would be required to reduce the number of iPads in the application in order to meet those requirements. So again, it's just a conscious way that you can be aware of as you're working through your grant application as to whether or not some of the things that you hope to purchase, whether or not it meets the RAND test. So another useful resource to help you determine whether or not something is allocable or allowable is the non-competitive federal funding matrix. So this funding matrix, it lists all of the allowable munis codes for the School Improvement Funds program. So we encourage you to review the column that's labeled ESSA Section 1003 School Improvement and not the one that's labeled NCLB School Improvement. So the current School Improvement Funds program is governed by ESSA. So that's a key factor when you're looking at this munis matrix, the funding matrix. Another thing to note is as part of some safeguards here, in that template that we sent to the schools, we only included those munis codes that are allowable under this program, and in GMAP, we also only included some munis codes there that are allowable. So it's the same, but your district may have some caveats and they may not want to open some of those codes and may suggest a different one for you. So you'll have to follow their lead on that. That is completely acceptable. But again, we did build in some safeguards into that template in GMAP as well to make sure we're using allowable munis codes. Okay, so there are several responsibilities. Remember early on we shared that this was a collaborative process. These funds will be awarded to the district, but the applications must be written by the school. And there are several district level officials who have responsibilities in this process as well. So if you're joining us today and you are a Title I coordinator or a federal programs coordinator, we just want to remind you that these funds are subject to Title I Part A requirements, which means that they must adhere to any Title I Part A policy or practice, including those that are of your district and those that are advised by the department. And that includes things such as time and effort, the labeling of purchases, record keeping, and so on. And as a reminder, these funds are subject to monitoring. So during the life of the grant, one of KDE's responsibility is to monitor them. We do those through desk monitoring or we do those in person. It varies based on time and also whether or not we're in a pandemic. So that also is a factor in determining whether or not you'll see us in person. So please bear in mind that we will be monitoring these funds in some form or fashion between once they're awarded and before the grant expires. And we'll talk more about the expiration of these in a few short slides. So we do encourage our finance officers to ensure that all the expenditures align to the district's policies and guidelines as well. Well, and here's the date. It's right here on the screen. So these funds must be spent by September 30th, 2022, and we will not be awarding carryover waivers for these funds. So they have to be spent to zero by September 30th, 2022. So please ensure that those funds are drawn down consistently. Okay, any questions about allowability before we talk about the supporting documentation that you must submit alongside the application? All right, I will move forward then. So your 2020-21 CSIP with evidence-based documentation and a signed principal assurance must be uploaded into GMAP with your application. So again, alignment is so very important and so very key here. The assurance that you're seeing on the screen, it's the last page in that template that we emailed everyone. So that's where you'll find that assurance. So we understand that schools are currently in the throes of planning for 2021 and now have added to the mix completing the SIF application. So please prioritize planning first with the added caveat to include evidence-based initiatives with level 1, 2, or 3 evidence that target your identified subgroup. By planning first, you will more easily satisfy the requirements for school improvement funds. And as a reminder, supporting evidence-based documentation must meet the compliance requirements established by the department. And Ruth is going to drop the link to that resource in the chat box so everyone has it, because again, it says 2020 CSIP with evidence-based documentation and a signed principal assurance. So she's dropping that for everyone into the chat box. And so you can pull that from there, but again, you can find that on the evidence-based website that's located within KDE's website. So once the school has completed that electronic template and has budgeted all funds, the principal will download and electronically sign or print and sign that principal assurance page. And again, that's the last page of that electronic template. Your district representative will need a copy of that completed template, including the signed assurance page, and a copy of your CSIP with that evidence-based documentation. Then from there, district level representatives will ensure that the contents of the application are entered into GMAP and that that supporting documentation is uploaded into GMAP as well. From there, once KDE receives an alert in our email that that application has been submitted, a KDE reviewer will be assigned to work with you throughout the approval process, and it'll take us a couple of weeks to work through each of those applications to get those approved for you so that you can begin using those funds. Typically, the reviewers of those applications are me, Natasha Stein, Ruth Swanson, and Dr. Matthew Courtney. So one of us will be the reviewers. Okay, so we are moving forward here with the awarding of funds. So let me pause to see if there are any questions in the chat box. And Ruth, if there are any that I missed that needs to be addressed, please chime in and let me know. I do see one here regarding when you say approve CSIP, who is referenced as approval. So in our ATSI schools, all improvement plans must go through your councils. So that's one approval process. And Ruth, remind me, are their plans subject to review and approval by the board as well?
Yes, for ATSI schools, that is an important part of their improvement plans.
I see here a question that the funding matrix is prompting to enter login information. Robert, if you don't mind, will you hit cancel on that and see if it'll populate for you? Sometimes if you just hit cancel, it will. It does that to me as well, so I'm not sure what is happening there. If it doesn't work, then I can download and email you a copy if it's still doing that. Thank you for that question, and thank you for checking it as well. Good question, Sherry. So no, KDE's approval of the CSIP is not required prior to the submission of the funding application. If you would like for Ruth or myself to take a look at those, we would be happy to. We're more than happy to do that, but it is not required. All right, so let's move forward here. When I sent out the initial email to everyone notifying superintendents of the grant opportunity and principals of this grant opportunity, I shared that exact award amounts would not be shared during today's webinar. Instead, we wanted to provide you with some background information on how we actually determine the funds that are awarded to each school. So we want to talk a little bit about that. So our approach at the department is when we award these funds, we do so in an equitable manner. So funds will be issued to schools based on a per pupil amount, or PPA, that is determined by the department, and then we multiply that per pupil amount, or that dollar value, by the total student population. And the total student population is based on your growth factor number that's submitted to the department on November 1st. So we use last year's November 1st growth factor number when we make this determination as to how much funds or how many funds your school will receive. And it's based on the whole school and not just a targeted subgroup that contributed to your identification. So it's the entire school. That's the number that we use. So a couple things to note about award amounts. One, once the application in GMAP is open and live for districts, it will already be pre-populated in there. But two, within or sometime next week, my hope is by close of business on Monday, if I get 2 thumbs up from the finance office, I'm going to email each of you a tentative amount that you can use for planning. So I will be sending that to you via email, but it will eventually be in 2 places. So a tentative amount from Natasha, I'll send that out to everyone that you can use for planning, and then in GMAP, we'll upload those amounts in there as well. So the tentative amount, good question, that will go to whomever was on that initial email. So it was the superintendent, the ATSI principal, the finance officer, and the Title I coordinator. And from there, you may forward it out to anybody else who needs those numbers as well. Is there a different PPA for ATSI versus CSI? In this instance, no. Kate, when we completed our awarding for this FY20 for these funds, they were together. So they are coming out of the same funding pot. So those are together. So it will be the same. Good question.
Okay, so in this section, we're going to review the deadlines and the timelines for the grant. So we ask that you please note the following deadlines. Your application should be complete and uploaded into the GMAP system by December 18th, 2020. Applications may be submitted and approved, and funds may be accessed before this date if your CSIP is completed earlier. So you're going through your normal, CSIP planning process. If by chance you happen to get your CSIP completed before that December 18th deadline, you can go ahead and submit this application, and you can access those funds after that application has been approved. The other thing I will say, if your CSIP is not finished by that December 18th deadline, you're not going to lose the money. That money is still there for you. So whenever you do get it finished and you do have the application aligned with your CSIP, then you can submit it. You just won't be able to access the funds, obviously, until that has been completed. So your assigned KDE reviewer will work with you to finalize your application. Funds may not be expended until the application has been formally approved in GMAP and the official award notification has been released. And please know that failure to respond to your assigned KDE grant reviewer could delay that start date of your activities. Finally, you have until September 30th of 2022 to spend the funds from this grant. And remember, no carryover waivers can be granted. So please be proactive in spending your funds. Please be very intentional in your planning process and really think about how these funds can be used and how they're going to be expended by that September 30th date of 2022. And I see the question, and I think I'm going to let Natasha handle this. It says spent or encumbered.
Encumbered. Thank you, Sherry. We use those interchangeably and quickly, but it is encumbered.
Okay, before I go on to kind of the summary, any other questions about those timelines?
So to summarize kind of what Ruth shared with us there, really no penalty for early submission and no penalty for late submission. We just wanted to give you some timeline with which you could work in the hopes that we had this money to you by January 1st, 2021. But again, once it's open in GMAP, all your processes have taken place internally with your CSIP, and the information has been entered into GMAP. If that happens around October 1 and we get it approved within a couple weeks of that, you are ready to spend those funds. We will alert our finance office to give you the official award notification, and you may begin drawing down those funds. So just to repeat and echo that. Okay, so we have made it to the end, almost the end of today's presentation. So we do have a couple next steps for everyone to follow. Ruth, did I skip? I skipped. Let me go back. There we go.
That's okay. And we've kind of gone through these at multiple times, but just to put a nice bow on it, make sure we're clear on everything. So the school improvement fund expenditures must support evidence-based practices that are based on strong, moderate, or promising evidence levels 1, 2, or 3, and they must be aligned to your 2020-21 CSIP. The application should be a collaborative effort with input from multiple stakeholders, along with that shared plan for submission with the district so that you get your information into GMAP. The application must be reviewed and formally approved in GMAP, and that award notification gone out before any funds can be drawn down. No activity should begin before that application has been approved. Remember, this is a school level grant. All the funds must be spent on services to support students in the identified ATSI school only. And again, time sensitive, all those funds must be spent or encumbered by September 30th of 2022. We cannot allow any carryover waivers. And then your application is subject to open records request.
So now it's time. Okay, couple next steps. One, Ruth is going to paste in the chat box the verification link. And again, please include your email address, your name in there to verify that you did participate in today's session. And again, that's the list that I'll use to send out a copy of those district level questions. So that's in the chat box now for you. And a couple of next steps, if you're a school level representative today, please begin reviewing the electronic template and working on that 2020-21 needs assessment and the CSIP to determine which evidence-based practices will be funded by the SIF grant to ensure that alignment. And then district level personnel, please establish the process and communicate it with your ATSI principals and staff on how that transfer of information will occur. There's our contact information on the screen. So we hope that we have given you some information to get you started here today and make you feel comfortable about this process and successfully completing that application. We're here to support you, so please feel free to stick around and ask questions if you'd like, or you do have our information there and you can email us, call us, whatever is needed, and we'll be certain to support you. So that is it for us today. So again, you are free to go, but if you have questions, please stick around and ask those should you have them. Kate, I don't have my spreadsheet in front of me, so I can't answer that off the top of my head. It's a percentage of our Title I, so we have to set aside 7% of our Title I award from FY20, and then from there, 95% of that gets released to schools. So I can tell you that much, but I don't remember the exact dollar amount.
And is that just for ATSI or ATSI and CSI?
No. That's ATSI and CSI and TSI when we have them. And we can prioritize. So some years we have just given those to CSI. Since we didn't identify any new, that's why we are moving in this direction to award to ATSI.
Great news. That's awesome. Thank you. We're just trying to get a ballpark idea of the amount of money.
You are very welcome. I'll have everyone an email by Monday that gives you an idea of what that number looks like to help you with planning.
That would be awesome. Thank you. Appreciate it, Natasha.
You're welcome, Kate.
Natasha, I have a question about enrollment.
Okay.
Can you-
What you got? Yes.
Okay. Early on in the training, you said to put October 1, 2019 on the electronic template, but that funding would be November 1. Is that accurate that we're using two different dates for enrollment?
Right. So enrollment for us is just to see that your expenditures align to what's in the application. So we're looking at your real number as of October 1, 2019, what was officially reported to the department. The other number is actually part of the formula. So they use that growth factor number, which helps us to predict or look ahead as to what it might be. So that's just for the formula portion of awarding.
Gotcha. Thank you. And another
welcome.
question about that tentative amount that we're going to get next week. Will that probably, most likely, definitely be lower than what we will actually get, kind of like our hold harmless amount for Title I?
No, I try to get it as close to what I'm sending over to GMAP as possible.
Okay.
The only time we've had an issue where it went the reverse was a growth factor number that we received was significantly higher. It was a self-reported number, and that was a mistake on the district's part. But what that resulted in was everyone else getting a bump up in funds. But for the most part, and we did instill some processes this time where we took a look at enrollment numbers and compared to that growth factor just to see that there was a close alignment of those two with our formula. Good question.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for all your good questions today.
Oh, GMAP is my best friend, I feel like.
Yeah.